A podcast host receives a tape and hears the final words of a man missing since 1993. The package arrived on a Tuesday, innocuous and brown, smelling faintly of dust and time. It was addressed to me, Julian Croft, but the return address was a blank space, a void where a name should have been. Inside, nestled in a bed of yellowed newspaper clippings from 1993, was a single cassette tape. No note, no explanation. Just the tape, its plastic case cracked at the hinge, a handwritten label scrawled in faded blue ink. Lake Elson, August 14, 1993. Forgive me. My studio was my sanctuary, a soundproofed room in the heart of Brooklyn where I dissected cold cases for my podcast, Echoes in the Static. I'd handled hundreds of artifacts from grieving families' dog-eared diaries, faded photographs, tear-stained letters. But this felt different. This felt like a confession sent from a ghost. I slotted the cassette into the old deck I kept for just such occasions. The one that whirred and clicked like a mechanical heartbeat. I slipped on my headphones, the plush cups sealing out the cities. Drone, and pressed play. For a moment, there was only the hiss of dead air. The sound of nothingness that always preceded a story. Then, a voice. Not a narrator, but a man, his breath coming in ragged, terrified bursts. It was the sound of pure, unadulterated fear. Oh God, please. The voice was young, maybe early 20s, laced with a desperate, pleading tremor. Behind him, I could hear the gentle lapping of water, the chirping of crickets, the distant cry of a loon, the sounds of a peaceful summer night. A stark, sickening contrast to the terror in his words. I didn't see anything. I swear to you, I'll say whatever you want. Please, just let me go. A second voice cut in. This one older, colder, a voice that was accustomed to being obeyed. It was smooth, almost reptilian, with an undercurrent of amusement that made my blood run cold. You saw enough, Daniel. You always did see too much, Daniel. The name hit me like a physical blow. Daniel Sterling. He was one of my earliest cases, a ghost who had haunted the periphery of my career for years, a promising art student who had vanished from a campsite at Lake Alcyon in the summer of 1993. His car was found by the shore. His tent zipped shut, his wallet and keys inside. But Daniel was gone. No body, no witnesses, no answers, just a black hole of a mystery that had swallowed a young man whole. It wasn't my fault. Daniel sobbed on the tape, his voice breaking. I didn't know who he was. I saw the car. The car, the cold voice repeated, the words dripping with a kind of bored menace. Yes, the car, and the girl. You saw them both, didn't you, son? No, I was just walking. I was looking for a place to sketch the sunrise. I didn't mean to intrude. There was a rustle of movement, the crunch of leaves under a heavy boot. I could almost feel the proximity of the second man, his shadow falling over Daniel. My own breath hitched in my throat. I was no longer in my studio. I was there, on the damp earth of the forest floor. A helpless observer to a 30-year-old execution. Intrusion is such an ugly word, the man mused. I prefer inconvenient. You've become an inconvenience, Daniel. A loose end, and my father, he doesn't abide loose ends. My father. The words hung in the static, a clue dangling just out of reach. Who was this man? Who was his father? Please, Daniel begged, his voice dissolving into a raw, guttural cry of terror that clawed at my eardrums. I have a family, my mum. She'll be worried. My sister, she'll get over it. People are surprisingly resilient. They grieve, they mourn, and then they move on. Life, as they say, goes on. Just not for you. A sharp metallic click echoed through the headphones. A gun being cocked, my heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the silence. This wasn't a recording of a threat. This was a recording of a murder. Any last words? The cold voice asked, the question almost a courtesy. Daniel's breath hitched. He was crying openly now, the sounds thick and wet. When he spoke again, his voice was a whisper, a final, desperate prayer sent out into the night. Tell my sister, Tell Amelia I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. Then, the sound, a deafening, percussive crack that ripped through the night, followed by a soft, wet thud. The crickets fell silent. The loon's cry was cut short. For a few seconds, there was only the lapping of the water, a gentle, indifferent witness. I tore the headphones from my ears, my hands shaking so violently I could barely control them. My stomach churned. I'd listened to hundreds of hours of evidence, of 911 calls, of frantic voicemails. But I had never heard a man's last breath. I had never been a witness, 3 decades removed, to the precise moment a life was extinguished. The tape kept rolling. The lapping of the water was joined by a new sound, heavy, rhythmic dragging. The sound of a body being pulled across the forest floor. Then, a splash. A heavy final splash that sent ripples out into the darkness. Both on the lake and in my soul. The cold voice spoke one last time. No longer to Daniel, but to someone else. Someone who had been there all along. A silent accomplice. You see, clean, no mess. No one will ever find him. Now, let's go. We have a long drive. The sound of a car door opening and closing. An engine turning over, the powerful rumble of a high-end vehicle. And then, as the car drove away, the tape captured one final chilling detail. The sound of a radio, playing softly in the background. A news report. And in political news, Senator Alistair Finch continues to deny the allegations, calling them a baseless smear campaign orchestrated by his opponents. The senator, currently favored to win the upcoming gubernatorial election, is expected to make a statement later this evening. The tape clicked off. The silence that followed was heavier, more profound than any sound I had ever heard. Senator Alistair Finch, a name that had dominated the headlines in the early 90s. A political titan, a man whose ambition was matched only by his ruthlessness. He had won that election. He had gone on to become one of the most powerful men in the country, and his son, the son, had just murdered a boy on a cassette tape. My hands were still trembling as I reached for my phone. I had to call someone, the police, the FBI, but who would believe me? A washed-up podcast host with an anonymous tape that implicated one of the most powerful families in America. They'd laugh me out of the room. They'd bury it, just like they buried Daniel Sterling. The newspaper clippings, I'd barely glanced at them. My fingers, slick with sweat, fumbled with the brittle yellowed paper. They were all from the summer of 1993, articles about Daniel's disappearance, filled with quotes from his devastated mother and his younger sister, Amelia. There were photos of the search parties, the grim-faced volunteers combing the woods around Lake Alcyon, and then I saw it. A small buried article on the back page of the local paper. Finch family compound vandalized. The article detailed a minor break-in at the Finch family's sprawling summer estate on the north shore of Lake Alcyon, just a few miles from where Daniel was last seen. The incident had occurred on the same night he disappeared. The police had dismissed it as teenage pranksters, but I knew better. Daniel hadn't been looking for a place to sketch the sunrise. He had been somewhere he shouldn't have been. He had seen something he shouldn't have seen. And the man on the tape, the one with the cold, reptilian voice, I knew who he was. I'd seen his face 100 times on the news, standing beside his father, a loyal, smiling son. Marcus Finch, the golden boy, the heir to a political dynasty, now a respected philanthropist and businessman, a man who had, by the sound of it, gotten away with murder. My mind was reeling, the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place with a horrifying, sickening clarity. This wasn't just a cold case. It was a conspiracy, a cover-up that had held for 30 years. And this tape was the key, but who had sent it? Who had held on to this evidence for 3 decades? A silent, ticking time bomb. The label on the case, forgive me, it was an apology, a confession. There was a third person there that night. Not just Marcus and Daniel. Someone else had witnessed the murder. Someone who had been haunted by it, crippled by guilt. For 30 years. My eyes fell on another clipping. This one, a Society page feature on the Finch family from a few months before the murder. A smiling Senator Alistair Finch, his arm around his wife, and next to them, a younger, more carefree Marcus, his arm draped around a pretty, dark-haired girl. The caption identified her as his girlfriend, a local girl named Sarah Jensen. Sarah Jensen. I didn't recognize the name, but I had a feeling I was about to get to know her very well. The weight of the tape in my hand felt immense, a physical manifestation of the secret it held. This was more than just a story for my podcast. This was a life, a stolen life, crying out for justice from a watery grave. And I was the one who had heard the call. My gaze drifted to the window. To the Brooklyn skyline etched against the bruised purple of the twilight sky. Out there, Marcus Finch was living his life, a life built on a foundation of lies and blood. He probably didn't even remember Daniel Sterling's name, but I did, and now, I had his voice. I had his final words, and I had the name of his killer. The cliffhanger wasn't a question of what I would do next. That was already decided. The moment I pressed play, I had stepped into that forest. I had borne witness. The question was, what would they do when they found out I knew? The Finches were not a family that tolerated loose ends, and I had just become the loosest end of all. My life, as I knew it, was over. And in its place, a new, dangerous purpose had taken root. I would be the echo in the static. I would be the voice for the boy who had been silenced. I would burn their world to the ground. The first person I had to find was Amelia Sterling, Daniel's sister, the one he had apologized to with his last breath. If the tape was the weapon, she was the reason to wield it. I found her living in a small, unassuming town in upstate New York, a place where people went to escape their pasts. She was a librarian now, a keeper of other people's stories, her own locked away behind a wall of quiet grief. When I called her, I didn't mention the tape. I told her I was revisiting her brother's case for my podcast, a half-truth that felt like a betrayal. She was hesitant at first, her voice brittle with a pain that 30 years had not managed to dull. But she agreed to meet. I drove up on a crisp autumn morning, the leaves on the trees turning to fire and gold. Her house was a modest Cape Cod, with a garden in the front that was meticulously, almost obsessively, tended. When she opened the door, I saw Daniel in her eyes. Were the same shade of deep, thoughtful blue, but where his, in the photos I'd seen, had been filled with a youthful spark. Hers were shadowed with a lifetime of loss. "Amelia," I said, extending a hand. "Julian Croft, thank you for seeing me." She didn't take my hand, she just nodded, her gaze fixed on the small, professional-grade audio recorder I held. "You're here to talk about Danny." It wasn't a question. I spent 2 hours with her, listening to her talk about her brother. She painted a portrait of a boy who was gentle and kind, an artist who saw beauty in the forgotten corners of the world. He was the one who would rescue spiders from the bathtub, who would spend hours sketching the patterns of frost on a window pane. He was not the kind of boy who got into trouble. He was not the kind of boy who just disappeared. The police said he must have run away, she said, her voice laced with a bitter, ancient anger. They said he was a troubled kid, an artist, you know how they are. Moody, unpredictable. But they didn't know him. Danny wasn't troubled, he was sensitive. The world hurt him sometimes, but he would never have run away. Not without a word, not from me. She told me about the last time she saw him, the day he left for his camping trip. He had been excited, eager to spend a few days alone with his sketchbook and the quiet beauty of the lake. He had hugged her goodbye, promising to bring her back a perfect skipping stone. He was happy, she whispered, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. That's the part that haunts me. He was so happy. And then he was just gone. As I was leaving, she stopped me at the door. "Why now?" she asked, her blue eyes searching my face. "After all this time, why are you digging this up again?" I hesitated, the weight of the tape a physical presence in my pocket. I wanted to tell her. I wanted to share the burden, to give her the answer she had been searching for her entire life, but I couldn't, not yet. It was too dangerous, because no one should be forgotten, I said. The words feeling hollow and inadequate, She gave me a long, searching look, a flicker of something suspicion, maybe, or a desperate, buried hope in her eyes. Then she nodded, a silent, weary acceptance. My next stop was Lake Elsyane. The place had become a character in the story, a silent, brooding witness. I needed to see it, to feel the air, to stand on the ground where Daniel Sterling had taken his last breath. The lake was beautiful, a vast sapphire expanse surrounded by a dense forest of pine and birch. It was the kind of place that belonged on a postcard, a picture of serene, untouched wilderness. But I knew what lay beneath the surface. I found the campsite easily enough. It was a small, secluded clearing, just a few hundred feet from the shore. The years had reclaimed it, but I could still imagine his tent pitched there, his campfire crackling in the twilight. I walked down to the water's edge, the damp earth, soft under my feet. The lapping of the waves against the shore was the same sound I had heard on the tape. A gentle rhythmic pulse that was now forever intertwined with the sound of a gunshot. I stood there for a long time, the cold autumn wind whipping at my jacket, trying to imagine the scene. Daniel, walking through the woods, his sketchbook under his arm. The flicker of a light, the sound of voices. A moment of curiosity that sealed his fate. And then, Marcus Finch. The golden boy with the cold eyes and the reptilian smile, a monster hiding in plain sight, protected by a wall of money and power. I could almost see him there, his expensive shoes stained with mud, the gun still warm in his hand. But it was the third person who haunted me, the witness, the one who had sent the tape. Sarah Jensen. Finding her was harder. She had disappeared from public life shortly after the incident, dropping out of college, cutting ties with her old friends. It was as if she, too, had vanished that night at the lake. I spent days digging, calling in favors from old journalist contacts, scouring online databases, chasing down cold dead-end leads. Finally, I found her. She was living in a small coastal town in Oregon, under a different name. She was married, with 2 children. She had built a new life, a fragile fortress against the past. When I found her address, I didn't call. I knew she would hang up. This was a conversation that had to happen face to face. I flew to Oregon, a sense of dread and anticipation coiling. In my gut, her house was a modern glass-walled structure overlooking the Pacific. A world away from the dark woods of Lake Elsyane. When she answered the door, she was older, of course, but I recognized her instantly from the society page photo. The same dark hair, the same wide, expressive eyes. But now, those eyes were filled with a deep, hunted fear. She knew who I was. The moment she saw me, she knew why I was there. "You need to leave," she said, her voice a harsh whisper. She tried to close the door, but I put my hand out, stopping it. "Sarah," I said, my voice gentle but firm. Or should I say, "Jennifer. I know what happened. I know you were there." The color drained from her face. Her carefully constructed world was shattering around her. And I was the one holding the hammer. "I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered, her eyes darting nervously back into the house, where I could hear the faint sound of children laughing. "Lake Elsyane," I said, the words hanging in the air between us. August 14th, 1993. "I have the tape, Sarah. I have the tape you sent me." Her composure crumbled. A sob escaped her lips, a sound of pure gut-wrenching anguish. She staggered back, her hand flying to her mouth. The fortress had been breached. The past had come crashing in. "Please," she begged, her voice cracking. "Please, you don't understand. He'll kill me. He'll kill my family." "Marcus?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "He told me if I ever said a word, he would find me. He said he would destroy everything I love. You can't imagine what he's capable of." "You can't." "I think I can," I said softly, my mind flashing back to the sound of the gunshot on the tape. "But he didn't count on you keeping a recording." She shook her head, a look of confusion on her face. "Recording what? Are you talking about?" "I didn't send you a tape." The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. I had been so sure, the anonymous package, the handwritten note. It had to be her. But the look on her face, the genuine, terrified confusion, she was telling the truth. If Sarah hadn't sent the tape, then who had? There was another witness. A fourth person. Someone who had been there that night, hidden in the shadows, a silent observer to the murder. Someone who had held onto the evidence for 30 years, waiting for the right moment. My mind raced, trying to process this new, terrifying piece of the puzzle. The conspiracy was deeper, more complex than I had ever imagined. And I was walking into the middle of it, blind. Sarah was still sobbing, her body trembling with a fear that was 30 years old but as fresh as an open wound. "You have to go," she pleaded. "If he finds out you are here, he'll know. I talked, he'll come for me." I looked at her, at this woman who had been living in a prison of fear for 3 decades, and I felt a surge of protective anger. She was a victim, just as surely as Daniel Sterling was. "He's not going to hurt you," I said. The words a promise I had no idea if I could keep. "I'm not going to let him." I left her there, a ghost on the edge of the continent, and flew back to New York, the mystery deepening with every mile. I had the murder weapon. I had the victim. I had the killer. But I was missing a crucial piece. The witness. The one who had set this whole thing in motion. The one who held the key to unlocking the truth. Back in my studio, I listened to the tape again. My ears straining to hear something I had missed. A clue hidden in the static. And then, I heard it. Just before the gunshot, after Marcus says, "Any last words?" there's a faint sound in the background. A sound I had dismissed as part of the forest's ambient noise. A soft, almost inaudible click. It wasn't a twig snapping, it was mechanical. The sound of a camera shutter. Someone had been there that night. Not just with a tape recorder, but with a camera. They hadn't just recorded the murder, they had photographed it. My blood ran cold. Somewhere out there, for 30 years, photographic evidence of Daniel Sterling's murder had existed. A picture of Marcus Finch, holding the gun, his face illuminated by the moonlight. A picture that could destroy the Finch dynasty forever. And the person who had that picture, the person who had sent me the tape, was now playing a dangerous game, using me as their pawn. They had pointed me in the right direction, given me just enough to start digging. But they were still in the shadows, pulling the strings, waiting. The question was, waiting for what? The conflict began, not with a bang, but with a quiet, digital whisper. A week after my trip to Oregon, an email appeared in my inbox. The sender was anonymous, the subject line blank. The body of the message contained a single, grainy image. It was a photograph, taken at night, from a distance. The quality was poor, the details blurred, but there was no mistaking what it depicted. A man, his back to the camera, was dragging a body towards the dark, shimmering surface of a lake. In the background, partially obscured by the trees, was a car, a dark, expensive-looking sedan. And standing by the car, illuminated by the open door, was a second figure. A woman, Sarah Jensen. My heart pounded in my chest. This was it. The photographic evidence. The ghost in the machine had sent me the first piece of the puzzle. They were testing me, seeing what I would do with it. I knew I couldn't go to the police. Not with this. The photo was too grainy, too circumstantial. It proved Sarah was there, but it didn't show the killer's face. It was just enough to be dangerous, but not enough to be conclusive. I decided to play their game. I released the photo on a private encrypted forum for cold case enthusiasts that I frequented. A place where theories and evidence could be shared away from the prying eyes of the mainstream media. I posted it with a simple cryptic message. Lake Alcyon, 1993. Does anyone recognize this car? The response was immediate and explosive. The forum lit up with speculation. Within hours, someone had identified the car. It was a 1993 Lincoln Town car, a model favored by politicians and corporate executives. And, as one user pointed out, a model that was part of the official fleet of vehicles used by Senator Alastair Finch's campaign that year. The connection had been made. The first thread had been pulled. I had set the fire, and now I had to wait and see who would come running towards the smoke. I didn't have to wait long. The next day, I received a phone call. The number was blocked. Julian Croft, a familiar voice, said. It was the voice from the tape. The cold reptilian voice of Marcus Finch, by blood turned to ice. He had found me. This is a mistake, he said, his voice calm, almost casual, but with an undercurrent of barely controlled rage. You're meddling in things you don't understand, things that are better left buried. I think I understand perfectly, I said, my own voice surprisingly steady. I understand that a boy named Daniel Sterling never came home from a camping trip. There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line, a silence that was filled with a palpable, menacing weight. You have something that belongs to me, he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. A tape. I don't know how you got it, but you're going to give it back, and you're going to forget you ever heard it. And if I don't, I challenged, my heart hammering against my ribs. He laughed, a short, humorless bark. Then you'll end up just like your friend Daniel, a ghost. An echo in the static. Do you really think you can win this fight, Mr. Croft? A podcaster against me? Against my family? We will crush you, we will erase you, and no one will even remember your name. The line went dead. I stood there, the phone still pressed to my ear, my body trembling with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. The threat was real. The beast had been awakened. The escalation was brutal and swift. The next day, my podcast was pulled from all platforms. The hosting company sent me a terse, legalistic email citing a violation of their terms of service. My website was taken down, replaced by a 404 error page. My social media accounts were suspended. I was being digitally erased, silenced, just as he had promised. Then came the financial attacks. My bank accounts were frozen, my credit cards declined. A series of frivolous, baseless lawsuits were filed against me, draining my savings, burying me in legal fees. I was being systematically dismantled, piece by piece. The worst part was the isolation. Friends and colleagues who had once championed my work now distanced themselves from me, afraid of being caught in the crossfire. They would see me on the street and look away, their faces etched with a mixture of pity and fear. I was a pariah. A man marked for destruction. Amelia Sterling called me, her voice frantic. She had seen the news reports, the whispers and rumors that were starting to circulate online. What's happening, Julian? She cried. What did you do? I couldn't tell her the truth. I couldn't put her in danger. It's nothing, I lied, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. Just a legal dispute. It'll be sorted out, but we both knew it was more than that. The Finches were sending a message, not just to me, but to anyone who might be thinking of helping me. Stay away, or you'll be next. The pressure was immense, a crushing weight that was designed to break me. I barely slept. I ate little. I spent my days in a state of hypervigilant paranoia, jumping at every shadow, every unexpected noise. I felt like I was being hunted, stalked by an invisible, all-powerful predator. And then, the second email arrived. Another anonymous message. Another photograph, this one was clearer. It was a close-up, a young man's face, his eyes wide with terror, his mouth open in a silent scream. It was Daniel Sterling. And behind him, out of focus but unmistakable, was the face of his killer. Marcus Finch. His features were contorted in a mask of cold, predatory rage. And in his hand, glinting in the moonlight, was the gun. It was the smoking gun. The undeniable proof, the image that could bring down an empire. My hands shook as I stared at the photo. This was the ace in the hole. The reason the anonymous witness had been so careful, so patient, they had been waiting for me to be pushed to the brink, to be stripped of everything, to have nothing left to lose. They knew that only a man with nothing left to lose would be desperate enough to use it. But the email came with a warning. A single line of text beneath the image. He knows about Sarah. He's going after her. A cold dread washed over me, colder than any fear I had felt for myself. My visit to Oregon, it had been a mistake. I had led him right to her. I had signed her death warrant. I had to warn her. I called her number, but it was disconnected. I searched for her online, but her digital footprint had been wiped clean. It was as if she had never existed. I was frantic. I called the local police in her town, my voice rambling, incoherent. I tried to explain the situation, the danger she was in. But they were dismissive, suspicious. Who was I? Just some crazy guy from New York making wild accusations. I was alone, powerless. I had the proof that could save her, that could bring justice for Daniel. But I was trapped, silenced, unable to get it to the people who could help. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. Marcus wasn't just trying to silence me, he was toying with me. He was making me watch, helpless, as he tied up his last loose end. He was making me complicit in her fate. I sat in my dark, silent studio, the photograph of Daniel's last moments. Burning on my screen, the weight of it all was crushing me. The fear, the guilt, the rage. I felt a wave of despair so profound it was almost physical, a black tide pulling me under. He was right. I couldn't win. He was too powerful, too ruthless. I had flown too close to the sun, and my wings were melting. But then, I looked at the photograph again, at Daniel's face. The terror in his eyes. The silent scream that had been trapped in that image for 30 years. And I thought of his sister Amelia, living a half-life of grief and unanswered questions. I thought of Sarah, a prisoner of fear, about to pay the ultimate price for a mistake she had made as a teenager. And my despair turned to rage. A cold, hard, diamond-pure rage. He thought he had broken me. He thought he had won, but he had underestimated me. He had underestimated the power of a man with nothing left to lose. I wasn't going to run. I wasn't going to hide. I was going to fight. I had one last card to play. One last, desperate, all-or-nothing move. I was going to leak the tape, and the photograph. I was going to release the truth into the world, a digital wildfire that no amount of money or power could contain. It would probably get me killed. But it was a price I was willing to pay. For Daniel, for Amelia, for Sarah. I opened my laptop, my fingers flying across the keyboard. I created a new anonymous email account. I attached the audio file of the tape. I attached the photograph of the murder. And then I started typing. I wrote out the whole story, everything I knew, everything I had discovered. I named the names. I laid out the conspiracy, the cover-up, the 30-year reign of terror of the Finch family. I compiled a list of every major news organization, every independent journalist, every blogger and activist I could think of. My finger hovered over the send button. This was it. The point of no return. The moment I set the world on fire. I took a deep breath, and I clicked send. The explosion was not immediate. It began as a tremor, a low rumble in the forgotten corners of the internet. The forums and message boards where I had first planted the seed began to buzz, then to roar. The photograph, Daniel's terrified face, juxtaposed with Marcus Finch's snarling rage, was a visual bomb. It was shared, reposted, and mirrored thousands of times before the Finch family's army of lawyers could even begin to play whack-a-mole. Then came the tape. My story, my narrative, gave it context. Suddenly, it wasn't just a grainy photo and a muffled recording. It was the final, desperate moments of a young man's life. News outlets, initially hesitant, were forced to acknowledge the growing firestorm. First, the online tabloids, then the more reputable digital news sites, and finally, the cable news networks. The story was too big, too shocking, too perfect, a storm of power, privilege, and murder to ignore. The name Daniel Sterling, once a forgotten footnote in a cold case file, was on everyone's lips. His high school photo was everywhere, the gentle, artistic boy next to the monster who had taken his life. The hashtag Justice for Daniel trended worldwide. The Finch family, for the first time in their meticulously curated existence, was on the back foot. They issued a furious denial, of course. Alistair Finch, now a frail, elderly man, but still radiating an aura of untouchable power, held a press conference. He called the allegations a vicious, unfounded attack on his family, a digital lynching orchestrated by his political enemies. He stood beside his son Marcus, who looked pale and shaken, his usual reptilian confidence replaced by a hunted, cornered look, but their denials were drowned out by the rising tide of public outrage. The tape was undeniable. The photograph was a stake through the heart of their carefully constructed facade. The world had seen the truth. And then, the plot twist. The one I never saw coming. It came in the form of a phone call, not to me, but to the lead detective on the newly reopened case, a bulldog of a man named Frank Rizzo, who had been pulled out of retirement. The original investigator on Daniel's disappearance 30 years ago. The call was from a lawyer representing a client who wished to come forward with new evidence. The witness was not Sarah Jensen. It was not some hidden fourth person. It was Senator Alastair Finch's wife. Marcus's mother, Eleanor Finch, the matriarch of the Finch dynasty, a woman who had stood by her husband's side for 50 years, a silent, elegant symbol of grace and loyalty, had decided to burn it all down. She had been the one to send me the tape. She had been the one to leak the photographs. She had been the ghost in the machine all along. Her confession was a bombshell that shattered the foundations of the Finch empire. She told the police everything. She had known about the murder from the beginning. Marcus had come home that night, covered in mud, his face pale with a mixture of adrenaline and fear. He had confessed everything to his father. Alastair's response was not shock or horror. It was cold, pragmatic calculation. The boy, Daniel, was a nobody, an inconvenience. His son's future, the family's legacy, that was all that mattered. The cover-up began that night. Alastair made the calls, pulled the strings, buried the evidence. He was the architect of the 30-year lie, but Eleanor had been horrified. She had seen the monster her husband and son had become. She had lived with the guilt, the secret, for 3 decades, a prisoner in her own gilded cage. She had watched Marcus grow into a man who was a hollow imitation of his father, his soul corroded by the secret he carried. What had finally pushed her over the edge? Sarah Jensen. When Marcus, panicked by my investigation, had decided to silence Sarah for good, he had made a fatal mistake. He had confided in his mother, believing she was still the loyal, complicit wife. He had told her his plan to take care of the Sarah problem. And in that moment, Eleanor had seen the abyss. She saw that her son was not just a man who had made one terrible mistake. He was a predator, ready to kill again to protect his secrets. And she could not let another life be sacrificed on the altar of the Finch family name. She had kept a secret of her own for 30 years. On the night of the murder, after Marcus had confessed, she had gone into his room. He had been careless, arrogant. He had left the cassette tape from his car's stereo on his dresser, and in his camera bag, the roll of film he had shot that night. Eleanor, a keen amateur photographer, had developed the film herself in her private darkroom. She had seen the horrifying images of Daniel's last moments, and she had kept them. One set of prints, and the negatives, a secret insurance policy, a weapon she never intended to use. Until now, she had been the one to find me. She had followed my podcast for years, drawn to my work on cold cases, to my obsession with giving a voice to the forgotten. She had seen in me a man who would not be bought, who could not be intimidated. She had chosen me to be her instrument of justice. Her confession, corroborated by the negatives of the photographs and the original unedited cassette tape, was the final nail in the coffin. The conspiracy was laid bare, a tangled web of power, corruption, and murder that reached the highest levels of society. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. The district attorney, under immense public pressure, had no choice but to act. Warrants were issued for the arrest of both Marcus and Alastair Finch. The climax was not a courtroom drama. It was a live, televised spectacle that played out on the manicured lawns of the Finch family estate. News helicopters swarmed overhead, their cameras broadcasting the scene to a transfixed global audience. Police cars, their lights flashing, streamed through the wrought iron gates. Officers in tactical gear surrounded the mansion. Alistair Finch, the once invincible Titan, emerged from the front door, his face a mask of disbelief and impotent rage. He was a king whose castle was crumbling around him. He surrendered without a fight, a frail, defeated old man. But Marcus was not with him. He had made a run for it. He had fled to the one place he thought he would be safe, the one place that held the secret of his original sin. He had driven to the family's old, abandoned compound at Lake Alcyon. He didn't know that the police were tracking his phone. He didn't know that he was leading them to the final piece of the puzzle. I was there. Rizzo, the detective, had called me. "You started this, Croft," he had growled into the phone. "You should be here to see how it ends." I stood with the police at the edge of the woods, the same woods where Daniel Sterling had walked 30 years ago. We could see the old Finch house, dark and dilapidated, a ghost of its former glory. They sent in a SWAT team. We heard shouting, a brief, desperate struggle. And then, they brought him out. Marcus Finch, his expensive clothes torn and dirty, his face bruised. He looked wild, cornered, a rabid animal trapped in the headlights. As they led him past me, his eyes met mine. There was no remorse in them, only a pure, seething hatred. "You," he spat, his voice a venomous whisper. "You did this." "No," I said, my voice clear and steady. "You did." I just turned on the light, but the story wasn't over. There was one more secret that the lake had yet to give up. While Marcus was being apprehended, a team of forensic divers was in the water, acting on the information from Eleanor's confession. And as the sun began to set, casting long bloody shadows across the water, they found him. They brought the gurney up from the shore, a long black bag covering the remains. 30 years. He had been there for 30 years. Just a few hundred yards from the place where his killer had slept on summer nights. Amelia Sterling was there. I had called her, told her to come. She needed to see this. She needed to bring her brother home. She stood by the water's edge, her face pale, her hands clasped in front of her. As the gurney passed, she reached out a trembling hand and placed it on the bag. "Danny," she whispered, her voice breaking. A single tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. "I'm here. I'm taking you home." The plot twist was not just that the killer was caught. It was that the truth had come from the most unexpected of sources. A mother's love, twisted into a terrible, righteous fury. A wife's loyalty, shattered by a secret she could no longer bear. The conspiracy was not just a crime committed by men. It was a silence kept by a woman, and in the end, it was a woman who had made them all pay. The trial was a media circus, a public exorcism of the sins of the powerful. The Finch family's empire, built on a foundation of lies, crumbled into dust. Alistair, his health failing rapidly under the strain of his public disgrace, died in his cell before a verdict could be reached. A quiet, ignominious end for a man who had once bestrode the world like a colossus. Marcus Finch was found guilty. The evidence was overwhelming, a perfect unbroken chain from the tape to the photographs, to his mother's devastating testimony. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. I was in the courtroom when the verdict was read. I watched his face, searching for a flicker of remorse, of regret, of anything human. But there was nothing. Only a cold, empty void. He would go to his grave, a monster, unrepentant and unredeemed. Eleanor Finch was given immunity for her testimony. She disappeared from public life, a recluse in a world that had once been her kingdom. I never spoke to her again. I didn't need to. Her actions had spoken louder than any words. She had sacrificed her son, her husband, her entire world, to atone for a sin that was not hers alone. It was a terrible, tragic, and ultimately, heroic act. Sarah Jensen was finally free. The threat that had haunted her for 30 years was gone. She came forward. Not as a witness in the trial. Eleanor's testimony had made that unnecessary but to tell her own story. She spoke of the fear, the guilt, the years of looking over her shoulder. She became an advocate for victims of trauma, her voice a powerful testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Her new life, the one she had built on the shores of the Pacific, was no longer a fortress. It was a home, and me. I got my podcast back. The offers poured in: book deals, TV shows, a new state-of-the-art studio. I was no longer a washed-up caster. I was a giant slayer, the man who had brought down the Finches. But I turned it all down. The glare of the spotlight felt cheap, tawdry. I had not done this for fame or for money. I had done it for Daniel. I went back to my small soundproofed room in Brooklyn, back to my old equipment, back to the quiet, forgotten stories of the lost and the voiceless. My work was not done. There were other Daniels out there, other echoes. In the static, waiting to be heard, the true cinematic payoff, the moment of real cathartic justice, did not happen in a courtroom or on a live news broadcast. It happened on a quiet, windswept hill in a small cemetery in upstate New York. Amelia had invited me to the burial. It was a small, private ceremony. Just a few of her close friends, the local minister, and me. Daniel Sterling was finally laid to rest, his name etched in granite, no longer a question mark but a statement. He had been found. He had been brought home. After the service, Amelia and I stood by the grave, the autumn wind rustling the leaves of the old oak tree that stood, sentinel, over the cemetery. "Thank you, Julian," she said, her voice soft but steady. The haunted, broken look in her eyes was gone, replaced by a deep, quiet peace. "You gave me back my brother." "He was never really gone," I said. "You kept him alive, all these years." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, smooth, grey stone, Speifix skipping stone. "I found this by the lake," she said, pressing it into my hand. The day they found him, I think he would have wanted you to have it." I closed my fingers around the stone. Its coolness, a tangible link to the boy I had never met, but whose life had become so intertwined with my own. We stood there in silence for a long time, the setting sun painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The world kept turning. The news cycle moved on. The name Finch would fade into history, a cautionary tale of hubris and decay. But here, on this quiet hill, a story had found its ending. A brother had been mourned. A sister had begun to heal. And a promise, made by a terrified boy in the last moments of his life, had finally been kept. He was sorry, and now, he could be forgiven. The justice was not in the punishment of the guilty, but in the peace of the innocent. That was the real victory. That was the payoff that the years that followed were quiet ones for me. I continued my podcast, but something had shifted. The fire of my ambition had been banked, replaced by a calmer, more focused sense of purpose. The Finch case had been a wildfire, a spectacular, all-consuming blaze. But my work now was more like tending a hearth, keeping a small, steady flame alive for those who were lost in the cold. I never became a household name. I never got rich, but I found a different kind of reward. The quiet gratitude in the voice of a mother whose missing daughter's case I had helped reopen. The tearful email from a man who had finally found out what happened to his long-lost father. These were the moments that sustained me. I kept the skipping stone Amelia had given me on my desk. A constant, tactile reminder of Daniel, and of the cost of truth. Sometimes, when I was working late, the city lights painting patterns on my wall, I would pick it up, its smooth surface a comfort in my hand. I thought of him often, the gentle, artistic boy who had seen too much. He had become a part of my own story, a ghost who walked beside me, not as a haunting, but as a guide. He reminded me of the fragility of life, and of the enduring power of a single voice to cut through the static of the world. Amelia and I stayed in touch. We exchanged Christmas cards, occasional emails. I watched from a distance as she rebuilt her life, not on the foundations of her grief, but on the memory of her brother's love. She started a small arts foundation in his name, providing scholarships for young, struggling artists like him. She had turned her pain into a legacy of beauty and hope. One day, about 5 years after the trial, a package arrived at my studio. It was small, wrapped in plain brown paper. with a return address from a P.O. box in a small town in Oregon. Inside was a single framed photograph. It was a picture of a smiling family on a beach, a man, a woman, and two laughing children. Their faces illuminated by the golden light of a setting sun. The woman was Sarah Jensen. She looked happy, truly happy. The last vestiges of fear finally gone from her eyes. There was a short, handwritten note tucked into the back of the frame. "Thank you, Julian, for everything. We all have our own lakes, our own ghosts. You helped me find my way back to the shore." I hung the photograph on the wall of my studio, next to a charcoal sketch of a lakeside sunrise that Amelia had sent me, one of Daniel's last pieces. They were my two bookends, the beginning and the end of a story that had redefined my life. The world is full of monsters like Marcus Finch, and men like his father who enabled them. They build their empires on the bones of the forgotten, their power a shield against the consequences of their sins, and for the most part, they get away with it. But sometimes, a voice cries out from the darkness. A tape is sent. A witness finds their courage. A mother's heart breaks in just the right way, and a man in a small soundproofed room presses play. Haunting is not in the memory of the crime, but in the knowledge of how easily it could have remained a secret. How many other Daniels are out there, their final words lost to the static, their bodies lying in watery graves? How many Finches walk among us, their hands clean, their secrets safe? That is the question that lingers. That is the echo that never fades. The world is a better place without the Finches' power in it, but the silence they left behind is filled with the ghosts of their other unknown crimes. Justice was served for Daniel Sterling, but the system that created his killers, the culture of power and privilege that protected them, remains. My work is a single flickering candle against a vast and encroaching darkness. But sometimes, a single candle is enough to show the way. I picked up the skipping stone from my desk, its weight familiar in my palm. I walked to the window and looked out at the city, a sprawling, indifferent beast. I thought of Daniel, and his last, whispered apology. He had nothing to be sorry for. He was just a boy who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. The ones who should be sorry are the ones who create the darkness. The ones who value power over people, secrets over truth. And my job, my purpose, is to make sure they have something to be sorry for. To be the echo, to be the static. To be the voice that will not let the world forget. The story of Daniel Sterling was over. But the work, the real work, had just begun.